Reed Piercey is a sophomore international studies major, originally from Mountain View, California. He has been a phone room volunteer at the Samaritans helpline since February 2016 and is a member of For Boston. Reed is also engaged as a senator in UGBC's Student Assembly, an editor of Al Noor, and a member of the Gabelli Presidential Scholars Program.
Thank you, Guillermo. All right. When I was a sophomore in high school, a young man in the class above mine committed suicide. I'd never met him. I didn't even know his name until after it happened. But it rocked my community to the core. Annika will know what I'm talking about. My high school was Jesuit, and as far as I knew, nothing like that had happened for decades. Everyone reacted differently. His parents and friends grieved, his classmates and our resident priest offered condolences, and everyone else filled the campus with this barely audible but constant whisper about what had happened. Amidst all the shock and grief, there was this question that burned on our lips but was never quite asked out loud. Why? My high school is wealthy and private. It doesn't mean that all of its students are, but it means that our campus is beautiful, our teachers are top-notch, we offer incredible service trips and emphasize social justice and tolerance. What could have made him so unhappy? Why would anyone in their right mind do that? The morbid curiosity about what exactly had happened the morning he took his life pointed to an answer, equally as unspoken as the question, that most of the student body had unconsciously agreed on. Something about him was messed up. It was the only explanation. He had somehow been different, imperfect, and we just hadn't noticed. Subconsciously, I think I believed it too. It was the only explanation, right? Had I known then what I know now, I don't know exactly what I would have done differently. I don't even know if I could have done anything, given that I didn't know him myself. But I would have taken something different away from his passing. I like to think I could have seen it not as a failure on his part, but rather as a failure on the collective part of his community, on the part of everyone who knew him and who didn't consciously make the effort to listen to him, to find out how he was really doing. But I would have no way of knowing that until 3 years later. So that brings me to January of last semester, when I found myself sitting around a table with people of different ages and backgrounds at Samaritans helpline training, being asked why I wanted to become a phone volunteer. Maybe it was because ever since helping a friend on my club swim team talk through her own suicidal thoughts, or since being late to school a few times because the train I used to get there hit someone, I felt like I should be doing more. I didn't understand how to relate to someone who was struggling with severe depression, and maybe I thought it was time for that to change. I'd been told I was a good listener. Maybe I thought I needed to prove to myself that that was true. Maybe it was because deep down it scared me. Whatever the real reason, I mumbled something about how the people in my life had been affected by suicide. And while that wasn't wrong, I failed to mention that we weren't exactly close. The truth is, I had no idea how much Samaritans would impact me. I stand here now, 10 months later, having almost unknowingly made one of the best decisions in my life. That time is all it's taken to completely transform part of who I am, which leaves me wondering how much of an impact Samaritans has had on the volunteers who've been there for decades. Just ask any Pulse or For Boston student placed there. That kind of proximity to distress places your difficulties into perspective like nothing else. So for those of you who haven't heard of it, Samaritans is a suicide hotline near Park Street and Boston Common that serves the greater Boston area. In practice, we take calls from most of Massachusetts and occasionally from all over the country. Samaritans came to Boston from the UK in the 1970s, and it's been growing nonstop ever since. Now, 40 years later, we can claim to have trained 5,000 volunteers and taken 2.5 million calls. Those numbers can seem intimidating, at least at first glance. At this point, I want to remind you that suicide is the 10th leading cause of death nationwide. Every year, it takes the lives of almost 43,000 Americans. And for every person who attempts to commit suicide and succeeds, another 25 people have made the same attempt. This means that we lose somewhere around $44 billion in cost to society every year, and that's not even to mention the human cost. But most people believe that these statistics don't even tell the full story, because the stigma around suicide and mental health means that most incidents don't even go reported. And at Samaritans, we get just a glimpse of that story. It's a misconception that every call we get is from someone about to take their own life. More often than not, the person on the other end of the line has simply had nowhere to honestly talk about the pain that they're feeling. That pain can come from anywhere, internal or external. A woman I talked to was questioning everything after a conversation with a friend that deeply challenged all of her most fundamental beliefs. Her entire worldview had been thrown into doubt, but she had no one that she felt like she could go to and who would take her seriously, understand her concern. Other people might see the source of her agony as unimportant or trivial, but describing it that way would have been an injustice because to her, it made her feel like there was no point in going on. All I did was give her a surface to bounce ideas off of, but that alone led to an incredibly absorbing conversation. She talked about what she believed and why, and the emotion and feeling in what she said almost erased the boundary of the phone. I felt like I was there, having a conversation with a friend not unlike some people I knew. I can't speak to her circumstances at that moment, or why the conversation she had had with that friend had happened. But what she needed more than anything in that moment was that presence to hear her innermost thoughts. The fact that she found it through a hotline doesn't matter. It matters that it was there when she needed it. Another caller was the first in her family to attend college. She had given up a ton to get to where she was. But the pressure she felt from her relatives, whose hopes and sacrifices and life dreams were predicated on how well she did, made her feel like she would fail in their eyes regardless of how successful she was. No amount of work she put in would be enough. She felt like there was no way she could win. And combined with all of the other stresses that made it hard to keep fighting, that burden led her to consider giving up. It was this endless cycle of disappointment from the people she cared about the most. Because of the expectations that were being placed on her, it was impossible to open up about this to any of her family members. Her and her family's desire to have her single-handedly carry forward their dreams and their hopes overpowered her ability to let other people in on her doubts. The ear she needed didn't and couldn't present itself in her life at that point. The fear and guilt that she felt kept going unexpressed, and that drove her to a dark place. Providing that ear is not a hard thing to do, but it's something that so many people are reluctant to do because of the honest dimension it adds to everyone's sometimes unrealistic images of those around them. In that case, I provided the ear, and even though she did most of the talking, that was all it took. She earnestly thanked me for being there at the end of the call. Some of that pain had been given a place to go. The call that affected me the most, though, began with a name. I had just told him mine, and I was waiting for the response. When it came, I sat bolt upright in my chair and listened closely. It was the name of one of my close friends, and although that normally wouldn't raise any red flags, it was an unusual name. The caller went on to talk about his age, where he was from, where he lived, and his heritage, and they all matched the person I had in mind. At this point, my heart was pounding out of anticipation for the difficulties that I suddenly imagined my friend having. Had I somehow missed the signs? Had I somehow overlooked someone that I thought was so important? I thought of texting him as soon as the call ended. But luckily, as the caller kept elaborating, I realized it wasn't someone I knew. But that sense of urgency that I'd felt at first never quite went away. As he told the story of a past trauma that he'd been through and how he'd finally opened up about it to someone, it occurred to me that anyone who had answered when I picked up the phone could have very easily been someone that I knew. The fact that this time it wasn't didn't make him any less deserving of someone to listen. His struggles with self-harm and depression are the same kinds of things that some of your friends probably struggle with, albeit silently, even if you may not know. For all I knew, I realized that friend of mine could very well need someone to listen just as badly. It just took a call like that to drive it home. These are far from the only calls I've taken that have stuck with me for days afterwards. Every time I hang up the phone, I'm a little different than when I picked it up. These direct experiences with distress can do nothing other than change how you interact with the people around you. For every conversation I've had at Samaritans, I found myself taking one more minute out of my day to listen and pay genuine attention to what someone says after I ask, "What's up?" or "How are you?" For every conversation, I've become a little more hesitant to throw that interaction away. And I felt myself get a little more thankful every time someone does the same thing for me. I've gotten a little more disappointed when I notice small talk taking up most of my time with someone, because I know that odds are they have something that they want to get off of their chest. I don't pretend to always be the person that they confide in. I don't have to be, but I'm way more conscious of giving them that chance, should they want it. I know I would. For every call, I've tried to take another moment to answer my friends' questions with more questions. Every time I notice that I can't remember their schedules or their birthdays or what's going on in their lives, I remind myself to try a little harder. If I can be present for callers at Samaritans that I've never met before, it should hardly be a difficult thing to do that for the people I see every day. Small gestures like these seem unimportant until you're reminded of why they matter so much. Recently, one of my closest friends confided in me that she'd been struggling with suicidal thoughts. I sat down and listened, and at that moment, I couldn't have given any better support. I felt guilty at first because I hadn't talked to her as much leading up to that conversation. But if she needed someone to be there for her, I just had to put that aside and be present. If it hadn't been for my time at Samaritans, I'm not sure that I could have been as effective of a support. Usually, we aren't comfortable trusting someone with that information, so I'm just lucky that she felt like we were close enough to be honest with me. But there are so many relationships where I can't count on that level of openness. So the least I can do is make it clear to them that I care. The least I can do is seek to understand, not to be understood. Besides the effect it's had on my day-to-day life, Samaritans has shown me how many myths and misconceptions are out there surrounding suicide and depression. A common idea that goes with suicide is the idea of talking someone down. We have this image of a man on a ledge, about to jump, and a friend or negotiator whose job it is to do all the talking and convince them to step down. And that does happen, but it's just not the ground-level reality of suicide. At Samaritans, our job is not to talk or advise or convince. It's to listen, to ask, and to make the caller feel heard, to show compassion. Ultimately, that's what someone facing suicide has been missing. Talking someone down prevents suicide in the moment, but not in the long run. Their situation won't get better unless they have that space to be listened to. And you can't give them that if you're the one telling them what to do. Something else I hear a lot is that suicide is a selfish act. From the perspective of their loved ones and the people around them, it's easy to see how you might view it that way. But if there's anything I've learned from the conversations I've had, it's that when you put yourself in the shoes of the person contemplating suicide, it's anything but. There's never any desire to hurt the people around them or to cause grief. Far from it. In fact, I've been told quite a few times that they feel like killing themselves would relieve their family of a burden, that it would somehow make the people they care about happier because they wouldn't have to deal with them anymore. As heartbreaking as it is to hear that, it's the truth. The person is often in so much pain that they see suicide as a way to end suffering for themselves and their family, not to cause it. What they're feeling is so acute that it's usually hard to look beyond the act itself and to broaden that viewpoint. One of the more harmful misconceptions out there is that having suicidal thoughts means the person struggling with them is weak. We often don't hesitate to blame the suicidal person for letting themselves wallow in that feeling or for not doing enough to try and get out of it, especially if the reason for their pain isn't that obvious. What anyone who's been there could tell you, though, is that being open about what you're going through actually takes an incredible amount of strength. There can be so much pressure on them to be strong, to appear healthy and stoic for everyone else, that it makes sharing your pain hard. For someone who's depressed, telling them to cheer up is as effective as telling someone with a broken leg to just try running again. We're reluctant to treat mental illness like any other kind of illness, which makes us reluctant to give people suffering from it the help they need. The fourth thing I'd like to mention isn't so much an idea as it is a mindset. When we hear about friends struggling with depression or suicidal thoughts, sometimes we jump to feeling bad for them. It's easy to look at someone from a distance and feel pity or sympathy. For someone looking to help a friend, this may seem like a good thing because it could inspire you to try and lend a hand. But Samaritans and the lessons it's taught me are built on empathy, not sympathy. There's an important difference there, and in the way that you perceive someone suffering from mental illness. The distinction between the two can be illustrated with a simple metaphor. Imagine you're walking along, minding your own business, and you notice a deep pit in front of you. When you look over the edge, someone's stuck at the bottom, all by themselves, in the dark. How you react now is up to you. Sympathy is peering down into the pit and just saying, "Poor guy," or "girl, I'm sorry that's happening to you." You look down at the person in there and think about how bad their situation is compared to yours. Sympathy usually involves trying to problem solve for that person or project your own opinions onto them. And of course, there is a time for problem solving. But even if you throw a rope into the pit, at the end of the day, you're holding yourselves above while they stay below. There's an inequality there that doesn't do anything to address the underlying issue. Empathy, on the other hand, would be to notice the person inside and to climb down into the pit. Now you're in there with them, and they're not alone anymore. You sit next to them at the bottom and simply let yourself be with that person. Show them that even though it's dark, they don't have to be by themselves. What you're doing is now informed by compassion, not pity. By letting yourself listen and feel alongside them, you create the kind of connection that they've been missing. And when that person's ready, maybe you can climb out together. This idea of sympathy versus empathy informs most of what I hope you take away from today. More than that, I think it can add to the mental health conversation at BC. There's been a lot of great discussion recently about stigma, how it affects and represses the way we talk about mental health issues and depression on this campus. I see that every time I get a call from someone who's never used the hotline before, and they start with a quick disclaimer. They say that they're not even sure they need a suicide hotline, that they really aren't suicidal or, quote unquote, that kind of person. But as we continue to talk, it usually turns out that they're dealing with incredible stress of their own. But many people still feel the need to try and seem normal, even when talking to someone at Samaritans, which is meant to be a non-judgmental service. We're so used to that judgment that seeming normal has become a kind of compulsion. On a college campus like BC's, it can be hard to pinpoint what normal is. But everyone seems to be chasing it, and everyone knows when they're not living up to it. College, and especially BC, is such an achievement and goal-oriented environment that it subtly pushes out things that are seen as weak or not accomplished. When we're going after our next internship or research project, we can forget to stop and admit that we struggle too, that we're not perfect. We don't have these non-judgmental spaces to be listened to, and the happiness of our students will keep hurting because of it. In such a crowded environment, the focus of every conversation and every class seems to be to get students to make their own voice heard, to get their own opinion out there. Not to simply sit and receive them from others without any expectation of giving your own in return. Whether you're in a small group seminar or sharing funny stories with friends, every thought is geared towards getting your own 2 cents in as soon as the next person is done talking. And that translates into other parts of our lives. You don't have to volunteer at a suicide hotline to help change this culture, but listening as if you did can do a world of good. Next time you run into someone that you haven't seen in a while or that you know well, take a few more minutes to listen to what they say. You have no way of knowing when just a passing conversation can help someone process everything that's going on in their life. Next time someone disagrees with you, instead of cutting out what they say, try to understand their point of view without throwing your own up as a defense. Next time someone looks a little down, ask how they are and mean it. Look to hear more about their experience than you share of your own. And if all of this sounds like you won't have anyone to listen to you when you need someone to talk to, rest easy knowing that what you give to other people usually inspires them to give the same thing in return. The lack of unconditional listening at BC is a problem that involves our whole community, and that means that the solution has to come from the community as well. What that looks like is up to us. In the next few months, I'm hoping to start an on-campus tech support service that will give people a space to be listened to. And that sounds great, but it will need to be staffed by individuals, students who are totally willing to give their time to receive others' experiences. The silver lining about missing this kind of non-judgmental peer support at BC is that it all depends on the effort of individual people. This isn't like a complaint you might have about the administration, where you feel like you can look forward to months of bureaucracy and persistence to make any real change. This depends completely on you and the choices you make in every little moment that comes your way. That's what it comes down to. And I'll end by reiterating something that I said earlier because I think it's so important. Seek to understand, not to be understood, and the rest will work itself out. Thank you.